we're told given g of x is equal to tan of x minus 3 pi over 2 plus 6, find g inverse of x, and they want us to type that in here. And then they also want us to figure out what is the domain of g inverse, the domain of g inverse of x. So I've got my little scratch pad here to try to work that through. So let's figure out what g inverse of x is. This is g of x. Let me just read. This is g of x right over here. G of x is equal to tangent of x minus 3 pi over 2 plus 6. So g inverse of x, I essentially can swap I can replace the x with the g inverse of x, g inverse of x. So I could write that x is equal to g inverse of x. So let's just solve for g inverse of x. Now let's take the inverse tangent of both sides of this equation. So the inverse tangent of the left-hand side is the inverse tangent of the inverse tangent of the inverse tangent of the tangent of something. The inverse tangent of the tan of this is going to be just this stuff right over here. It's just going to be that. It's going to be g inverse of x. To solve for g inverse of x, g inverse of x is equal to the inverse tangent. So this side is now on that, or this side's now on this side. So plus 3 pi over 2. Plus 3 pi over 2. So let me actually type that in. Let me see if I can remember it, because I'm about to lose this on my screen. So inverse tangent of x minus 6 plus 3 pi over 2. So let me write that down. Type this. So g inverse of x is going to be the inverse tangent. So I could write it like this. The inverse tangent plus 3 pi over 2. And it did interpret it correctly. But then we have to think about what is the domain of g inverse. What is the domain of g inverse of x? The domain of g inverse of x. And if we imagine a unit circle, so that's a unit circle right over there. I guess we can imagine it to be a unit circle. My pen tool is acting up a little bit. It's putting these little gaps in things, but I think we can power through that. That's a unit circle. That's the x-axis, and that's the y-axis. If you form an angle theta, if you form some angle theta right over here, or I guess you could call it the terminal ray of the angle, is the slope right over there. And you can get a tangent of any theta except for a few. So you can find the tangent of that. You can find the slope there, there. But the place where you can't find the slope is when this ray goes straight up, or this ray goes straight down. Those are the cases where you can't find the slope. The domain of tangent, so tangent domain. So the domain is essentially all real numbers, all reals, except multiples of pi over, I guess you could say pi over 2 plus multiples of pi, except pi over 2 plus multiples of pi. Because if you have pi over pi, you add another pi. So this is the domain, but given this domain, you can get any real number. So the range here is all reals. Now, when you're talking about the inverse tangent, by convention, you're going to, to make tangent invertible as this angle right over here. The convention is you restrict its domain. So you restrict the domain. Any domain for any theta, there's only one theta in that domain that, inverse tangent can, the convention is to restrict all reals, but its range is restricted. Its range and not including those. So let's look at the domain of g inverse. I could put any real number in here, any real number here. But they're not asking us the range of g inverse. Actually would have been a more interesting question. But actually, just for fun, and let's just verify that we got the question right, and we did. But just for fun, actually, I am curious. Let's just think about what the range of 3 pi over 2. So the range for the entire function, So the range for this thing, the range, which is just pi, or 2 pi, or 2 pi, g of x.